It was one of those blistering afternoons where the city felt like it was melting from the inside out in traffic, snarled like a tangled mess of impatience and honking egos with drivers, wiping their brows and muttering under their breath as they inched forward. Yet amid the heat waves rising off the asphalt and the chaos of impatient engines, there stood a young girl named Rena, waiting outside a modest cafe with a brown bag of leftover sandwiches in her hand and a pair of tired eyes that somehow still held on to a strange and stubborn kindness, not often seen in the cruel rhythm of this rushing world. And as she looked around the sweltering street, leaning against her sun-scorched yellow hatchback, she noticed a man waving his hand desperately, trying to flag down help, drenched in sweat, his clothes smudged and torn, his posture sagging with exhaustion, and the weight of a large delivery bag strapped to his back that looked as though it had endured 100 storms without shelter. Sight of him was hard to miss, not because he was loud or dramatic, but because of the thick stench rising from his body. An unpleasant mix of spoiled food, old engine grease, and days of sweat baked into the fabric of his shirt which clung to his back like regret. People walking by visibly recoiled, turning their faces. Some even laughed or commented cruelly, as if mocking a man who smelled bad was a form of entertainment. But Rena watched all of this and didn't look away. Instead, her heart pulled at her like a thread, unraveling a memory from her own life of once being ignored when she needed help. And so, with a slow, deliberate step forward, she asked him softly if he was all right, and the man turned, revealing a full-face helmet smeared with dirt scratched across the visor, muffling his voice as he stammered that his motorbike had broken down, and he had 5 more deliveries to make, all now delayed and likely to cost him his job if he didn't make it in time. And without even flinching at the stench or the grime or the awkward attention they were attracting, Rena fished out her car keys and asked if he needed a lift. And for a moment, the man didn't respond, as if his ears couldn't process kindness spoken so casually in a city built on distance. But then he gave a small nod, and they both climbed into her tiniest car, which still smelled faintly of cinnamon and coffee beans from her morning shift. And though the first few minutes were wrapped in silence, and the heavy presence of his odor lingered between them like an invisible wall, Rena simply rolled the windows down and turned up the radio, humming along to a song that spoke of open roads and second chances. And eventually she asked where the first stop was. Annie muttered the address with hesitation, still unsure whether to trust this stranger who offered him help without asking for anything in return. And they drove through narrow lanes, swerving past honking cars and street vendors shouting their last deals before sundown, her car coughing on steeper roads, yet never slowing her spirit. And whenever they stopped at a traffic light, people would glance in and wrinkle their noses or whisper among themselves, but Rena met their stares with calm indifference and a slight smile that said she knew what she was doing and didn't need their approval. And as they reached the first delivery destination, a posh building with mirrored glass walls and perfectly trimmed hedges, the man unbuckled, silently climbed out, and ran up the steps with the food bag while Rena waited, tapping the steering wheel in rhythm to the music. And when he returned, he handed her a cold bottle of water and murmured a thank you that sounded almost like disbelief. And she smiled and told him he didn't need to thank her for being decent. And they continued to the second stop, then the third each time. He ran up, returned sometimes with a thank you gift from customers like a juice box or a biscuit pack, and she kept them all in her passenger seat like tiny trophies of the journey they were sharing. And between deliveries, he started talking. Just fragments at first, then longer pieces, as if the silence in the car had softened his fears. He told her how he used to be an engineer with a good job and a better suit, but things had unraveled quickly after a business deal collapsed and debts swallowed his savings, and his parents, who lived in a distant village, could do little except pray, and he didn't want to tell them how bad it had become. So he left his apartment, took what he could, and started fresh sleeping in shelters, working night shifts, and eventually getting hired by the delivery service that paid little, but gave him a reason to keep going. And Rena listened with a quiet grace, her eyes never judging, only nodding and asking questions that made him feel seen as more than just a man in a helmet and sweat-soaked clothes. And she told him about her own struggles, about being raised by a single mother who cleaned offices, and how Rena had juggled part-time jobs since she was 15 to pay her college fees, and how she dreamed of starting her own food truck one day, serving simple meals with honest smiles, and he chuckled beneath. The helmet saying he hadn't heard someone talk about dreams in a long time because most people were too busy surviving to believe in anything beyond the next paycheck. And by the time they reached the fourth delivery, the air had cooled and the city had begun to change colors from burning orange to a softer gold, and Rina found herself looking at him not as a stranger, but as someone whose pain she could understand because her own life was built from the same broken bricks and stubborn hopes. And when he got back from the fifth delivery, he handed her a small chocolate bar the customer had refused, and said she should take it for the road, and they both laughed at the absurdity of how something so small felt like a treasure. And when she asked if he wanted her to drop him back at the warehouse, he shook his head and said he'd walk from there. But before stepping out, he hesitated, then reached into his delivery bag and pulled out a crumpled brown paper parcel, explaining that it was a canceled order and it would be thrown out anyway, so she might as well enjoy it. And Rina took it with a thank you more heartfelt than she had expected, and as he began to walk away, his shoulders still heavy, but his steps a little lighter, she leaned out of the window and asked his name, and he paused, turned slightly, and replied, "Arov?" And something about the way he said it stuck with her, even after he disappeared into the crowd, his back blending into the sea of commuters and honking cars and glowing lights. And Rina sat there with the parcel on her lap and a strange tightness in her chest, as if the day had shifted something inside her. And even as her stomach rumbled from hunger, she didn't open the parcel right away. Instead, she sat still, thinking about how sometimes people came into your life wearing the scent of despair and the mask of misfortune, but carried within them a story that could break your heart open and maybe fix parts of you that had been quietly aching. And though she had no idea whether she would ever see him again, a strange certainty bloomed in her chest that this was not their last meeting, not by fate, not by chance, but by something deeper that had moved quietly through that one afternoon where a poor girl chose to help a smelly stranger and unknowingly stepped into a story that would change the rest of her life. Rina couldn't shake the thought of him, even days after their brief and unexpected meeting, and though the parcel they'd given her that evening had turned out to be a simple box of warm biryani wrapped in foil and steam, she remembered it not for the flavor, but for the strange feeling that came with it, the sense of having been seen by someone who understood what it meant to fight quietly every day to be invisible and still survive. And though she had no way to contact him, she found herself glancing at every passing delivery rider in hopes of spotting the helmet with the scratch across the visor, wondering if he was still making deliveries or if life had shifted course for him again, just as it always did for people who were used to living on the edge of uncertainty. And 1 week later, while she was wiping down tables after her shift, a loud murmur stirred near the cafe entrance, and she looked up to see a man in a black tailored suit standing tall with an air of quiet power, scanning the room as if looking for something or someone, and her breath caught in her throat, not because of his sharp jawline or expensive watch, but because in his left hand he held a full-face helmet with the exact same scratch across the visor. And in that moment she knew, and her heart thudded like a drum as he walked slowly toward her with a look that held surprise and relief, and something deeper. He was clean-shaven, his hair neatly styled, his clothes carrying not a trace of the man she had picked up on the street yet. She recognized him instantly, because you don't forget someone you've seen at their lowest, and he didn't pretend to be someone else either. He stopped in front of her and gave a small smile that barely touched the corners of his lips and simply said, "Thank you again." And she stared at him, unsure what to say or do, as her coworkers watched curiously, some whispering about the handsome stranger speaking to the girl who usually cleaned up the crumbs. But Arav didn't seem to care about the looks or the confusion. He asked if she had a few minutes to talk, and she nodded, unsure where this would lead, and they stepped outside into the golden light of a setting sun standing near her yellow car. Like they had just a week ago, though, the roles now seemed reversed, and he began to explain everything. How the smelly delivery guy she had helped was never just a delivery guy, but in fact, the hidden owner of the very company he had claimed to work for, a company he had started years ago from scratch before it was stolen from him by his co-founders in a ruthless boardroom betrayal, leaving him with nothing but a legal battle and a bruised soul. And how instead of drowning in self-pity, he decided to disguise himself and returned to the streets, not to deliver food, but to study how his company truly treated its workers from the ground up, and to see how people in the real world behaved when no one was watching, and how in that journey, filled with rejection, judgment, and silent suffering, she had been the only person who looked at him with compassion and not disgust, and that simple act of kindness had done more for him than 1,000 boardroom deals ever could. And Rena listened, unable to believe that the man she had teased in her cinnamon-scented car was a millionaire in disguise, but his words carried a sincerity that needed no proof, and she found herself smiling quietly as he continued saying that after their meeting. He couldn't stop thinking about her, about how someone with so little could give so much without asking anything in return, and he had spent the last week tracking her down, speaking to cafe managers, cross-referencing delivery maps, and finally standing here now, unsure if she'd even want to see him again. And she asked why he'd go to such lengths, and he replied that sometimes you meet people who make the world feel different, softer, real, and you don't just let them walk away. And for a long moment they stood there, neither saying anything, because the silence between them no longer felt awkward. It felt sacred and filled with a truth neither of them could deny. And when he offered to drive her home, she laughed and said she'd rather drive him this time. And so they sat once more in her small hatchback, this time without the smell, or the stares, or the heat. Just two people with stories wrapped around them like armor, slowly taking it off piece by piece. And as she drove through the streets she had memorized since childhood, he asked her questions about her dreams. It's about her food truck idea, about where she saw herself in 5 years, and she answered honestly without trying to impress him, and he listened with a fascination that made her feel like her dreams were not only valid, but inevitable. And when they reached her home, a modest one-room flat, shared with her mother, who was out working the night shift, he stepped out and looked around, not with judgment, but curiosity, asking if she'd mind if he came up for tea. And though she hesitated briefly, unsure how her mother would react to seeing a stranger in a suit in their tiny kitchen, she nodded and led him upstairs, and they sat cross-legged on the floor, sipping oversteeped chai from mismatched cups and sharing stories about childhood regrets and the weird things they both liked, like eating cereal without milk or counting stairs while climbing. And by the time he left, it was almost midnight, and the city was asleep under a blanket of stars. And he turned to her before leaving and said something that made her heart race. He said, "I don't know where this is going, but I know I want to find out with you." And she nodded, feeling the kind of warmth that starts in your chest and spreads through your limbs until you wonder how you ever lived without it. And in the days that followed, they met again and again, sometimes at sunrise walks, sometimes over lunch at hidden food stalls, sometimes just sitting in her car talking about things that didn't matter and yet meant everything, and people began to notice. The girl who once went unnoticed was now often seen smiling into her phone or laughing at texts only she could read. And the cafe girl started guessing who he was, not knowing they had once all refused him at the curb because he had smelled too bad, and now he was the man every magazine was talking about after regaining control of his company and announcing a new plan to revolutionize the way food delivery workers were treated, with better wages, health benefits, and more respect. And in his interviews, when reporters asked what changed his heart, he smiled and said one girl with a kind voice and a yellow car. And though he never revealed her name, everyone in the cafe knew, and they began to treat her differently with a respect born from awe. But Rena remained the same, soft-spoken, hard-working, never letting the noise of attention change the quiet rhythm of who she was. And one evening, he took her to a hilltop above the city where the skyline glittered like a jewelry box, and the breeze smelled of new beginnings. And he looked at her with eyes that no longer carried the weight of disguise or doubt, and told her that he loved her not for helping him when he was low, but for loving the part of him he had almost forgotten existed. And she said she loved him. It's not for his money or title, but because he was honest and kind, and broken in a way that matched the cracks in her own soul. And they stood there hand in hand, letting the world spin around them without asking for anything more than this moment. And back at the cafe the next morning, a new luxury car pulled up outside, but no one was surprised When Rena stepped out of it, still wearing her apron, still holding a brown paper bag, still smiling like the girl who once gave a stranger a ride and got a lifetime in return, the city had begun to whisper about them in hushed awe, not because they were loud or flashy or desperate for attention, but because there was something quietly powerful about the way Rena and Arav moved through the world now, as if they were made from the same scarred pages of a book no one ever dared to read out loud, and though people often assumed she must have changed after becoming close to a man so powerful, so wealthy, so adored, she hadn't, in fact. She still woke up before dawn brewed. Her mother's tea packed her cafe apron and tied her hair the same way she always had, because the love Arav gave her didn't ask her to be anything other than herself, and that was the most revolutionary thing of all. But the world outside was not always kind, and neither was fate, which often tested love not through fire or fury, but through silence. Misunderstandings and fear disguised as practicality, and so when the first storm arrived, it didn't look like betrayal, it looked like a boardroom. It sounded like investors asking questions. It felt like pressure mounting behind closed doors, where Arav was told again and again that while Rena may be lovely, she didn't belong at charity galas or international conferences or on the arms of a man whose every handshake could raise or drop stocks, and though he pushed back hard, reminded them that the very spirit of the company had been reborn. Because of a girl who treated everyone like a human being, not a headline. They smirked behind tailored suits and whispered to each other about public image and market confidence, and Arav found himself at a strange crossroads between love and legacy, between truth and the exhausting need to constantly prove that love didn't have to be filtered through class or power. And he didn't tell Rena right away, because she was happy, because she was sketching food truck designs in her journal, and working extra hours to support her dream because she had finally started to believe she belonged in a world that once ignored her, and he couldn't bring himself to tell her that some people still didn't see her worth, and so he kept it all hidden, bottled tight behind reassuring smiles and gentle kisses, and whispered promises that tomorrow they'd finally go look at the first food truck model together, and she believed him not because he lied. Well, but because love makes us believe in the best, even when the signs say otherwise. And so when he canceled the meeting the third time, claiming an urgent investor call, her heart cracked, not because of the cancellation, but because for the first time, he didn't look her in the eyes when he said it, and she didn't question him. She simply nodded and went back to her cafe job, wiping tables with hands that no longer felt steady, and at night when he called, she still answered with the same warm hello, masking the ache that had started to live quietly in her chest like an unwanted tenant. And on his end, he sat in a silent penthouse looking at photos of her on his phone, longing to reach through the screen and return to the version of himself that had once sat in her cinnamon-scented car, ashamed, broken, and honest. Before he could speak, she would say something soft and cheerful, and he would forget what he needed to say, and so the silence grew between them like ivy, slowly wrapping around the foundation of something once solid. And then one evening, while scrolling through social media, Rena stumbled upon a headline that made her fingers freeze: a gala event held for investors and partners of Arav's company. Photos everywhere, flashing lights, elegant gowns, a world that looked like a magazine spread, and in the corner of one frame, Arav stood smiling in a sharp suit, posing with a model whose arm clung to his as if she belonged there, and the caption read, "The future of tech elegance and influence in Rena." Didn't cry. She simply stared at the image until it blurred. Not with tears, but with the realization that maybe she had been foolish to believe kindness could outrun the walls built by the rich to keep people like her out. And when Arav called that night, she didn't answer, and he called again and again, and finally left a voice message that trembled beneath his words, saying he was sorry he should have told her everything that the woman in the photo meant. Nothing that the event meant, nothing that she meant everything. But it was too late. She had shut her heart like a window in a storm, and for the next few weeks, they drifted apart like boats pulled in opposite directions by tides neither of them could name. And her cafe shifts grew longer, her food truck sketches dustier, and Arav buried himself in work, throwing himself into projects that felt emptier, without her laughter in his ears. And when he finally showed up at her cafe with flowers and eyes that carried weeks of sleepless guilt, she looked at him and didn't speak for a long time, and when she finally did, she asked not why, but how he could forget what it felt like to be judged and excluded and small and he didn't have an answer because he had forgotten, and that hurt him more than her silence, and she didn't. Pushed him away, but she didn't welcome him either, and he left that evening not with anger but with a weight he didn't know how to carry. And in the following days, something remarkable began to unfold, not between them but within them, because Rena began to remember who she was before she met him, a girl who believed in grit and late nights and laughter, and she poured her sorrow into her dream, taking a risk and using her tiny savings and a small loan to buy a used food truck, battered, rusty and dented but full of promise, and she painted it herself yellow with swirls of orange and a sign that read, "Soul Meals, food made with heart," and she opened it on a corner where the breeze smelled of rain and the sky felt wide and free. And on her first day she sold out in 4 hours and cried, not from sadness but from a joy so deep it shook loose all the fear she had hidden for so long. And the city noticed that people came back the next day and the next. Talk of the neighborhood and bloggers and food critics began to write about the girl, who cooked with her sleeves rolled up and a fire in her eyes, and Arv read every word from his quiet office, unable to sleep at night, wondering if he had lost her forever. And one Sunday morning he drove to the food truck and stood in the queue. Like everyone else, dressed not in a suit, but in jeans and a plain black hoodie, waiting for his turn. And when he reached the counter, she looked at him and smiled. Not the way she used to, but in a new way. Strong, independent, knowing her worth, and he ordered whatever she recommended, and when she handed it over, their fingers brushed, and he said, quietly, "I miss your stories," and she replied, "I never stop telling them, just stop telling you," and he nodded because he understood, and then she asked him if he wanted to sit and eat with her after the crowd thinned, and they sat on overturned crates behind the truck sharing rice and stories, and she asked him what he really wanted, and he told her, not a company, not a title, not a seat at a gala, just her, just the way she was, just her laughter and her stubborn dreams and her cinnamon car and her mother's oversteeped chai. And she believed him not because of his words but because of his eyes, which no longer darted or searched but stayed steady and full of hope. And over time, it's not in grand gestures but in quiet consistencies, they found their way back to each other. He didn't sweep her off her feet, because she had never needed that. He simply stood beside her every evening, handing out meals, taking orders, washing dishes, while wearing an apron over his designer jeans. And when people asked, "Isn't that the tech guy?" he'd smile and say yes. But more importantly, "I'm hers." And slowly the world began to understand that this wasn't just a love story, it was a story of redemption, of choosing its old over spotlight, of rebuilding from truth and not image. And 1 year later, under a starlit sky with the city lights flickering like candle flames, he knelt not with a diamond ring but with a simple silver band, and asked if she would build a life with him, not on red carpets but in food trucks and sunrises and honest fights and shared dreams. And she said yes, not with tears but with a grin that cracked open the universe. And the people who once laughed at the stinky delivery guy now watched with awe as the richest man in the city married the girl who gave him a ride, not knowing she had also given him back his soul. And together they opened 10 more Soul Meals trucks across the country, each one dedicated to hiring workers who had been forgotten, ex-convicts, single mothers, college dropouts, dreamers and drifters. And they built a foundation that fed not just mouths but hopes. And at every truck there was a photo framed behind the counter of a yellow hatchback and 2 people sitting inside with the windows rolled down, laughing while the wind tangled their hair. And beneath it, a quote that read, "Kindness isn't weakness, it's where all strength begins." And as the years passed and the world changed and businesses rose and fell, people still told the story of the girl who helped a smelly delivery guy, not knowing he was a CEO, and how in return he gave her not just love or money, but the wings she had already grown herself.